Coming up on This Week in Computer Hardware, CES 2020, AMD eats Intel's lunch with a 4000 series mobile CPU and a $4,000 processor that does $20,000 worth of work. Gaming monitors, Hertz versus frames per second, LineDoc's excellent upgrade for your MacBook, and so much more coming on the 14th hole. No, it's all coming up next on Twitch. This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you from LastPass Studios. Using the same password everywhere is a security nightmare just waiting to happen. LastPass easily creates unique passwords for every site. Visit lastpass.com/twit.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, episode 548, recorded on January 9th, 2020. Ryzen 4000 mobile and a $4,000 CPU. Let's talk about CES. Welcome to Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, Twitch weekly show that is all about hardware, people. Desktop, mobile, cell phones, consoles, networking, graphics, gaming, mayhem, the Internet of Stuff, which stands for something else if you're on the Twitters. We love hardware, which is part of why we love CES, not the Consumer Electronics Show, CES, which is where I am right now. And Sebastian Peak is home in the comforts of civility and not the raw, aching financial jungle that is CES. Well, actually, I was going to say Las Vegas, but you know what I mean. Like, there's no air here. You must disintegrate on contact with CES or Las Vegas in general.
It's different. Yeah, it's a huge shift for me. And I'm not sure if you're talking atmospherically, the change in weather that I experience coming from Michigan all the way to Las Vegas every year. But it hurts if you're not used to this level of dryness. CES, in case you didn't know it, if you haven't been following the CES news for 2020, CES is absolutely, totally, and utterly changing, which may not be a bad thing. Certainly it's a good thing for CES, the show. It's just getting very, very different. For example, this year, the prime keynote was Delta, the airline, talking about the technology that makes Delta the airline, the experience that it is. And I think the coolest thing I've seen so far is WaterGen's Jenny, which I actually haven't seen. I just found information on it, and I would like to see it. It's essentially a humidifier that looks like a water cooler, and it can pull up to 30 liters per day of clean, pure drinking water out of the air. Probably not in Las Vegas because there's no moisture in the air, but for example, in Michigan or other parts of the country, it could make it happen. I just find that fantastic and wonderful, except I was hoping. So you mean within your own house?
Yes.
Take the moisture out of it. It's like a dehumidifier, and then the tank, instead of dumping it out, you drink it.
Bingo. You put it in your water bottle. Yeah, well, okay, I can understand. Well, in any case, we're not here to debate the quality of water coming out of this device. But it's funny, right? CES starts in Los Angeles. It's all about audio gear and televisions. AV gear was overcome by computing and home theater and the internet, and now it looks like all that is being overcome by technology in a more general sense, which is interesting and something we're not going to get too deep into because there is some excellent hardware news this week. Not as PC-centric as it was last year, but still some pretty awesome news. And I think the biggest story, I have touched the new Dell XPS, and it feels very, very good. The cameras are mounted, tiny camera mounted in the bezel above the screen, so we don't have nose camera issues. And I'm very, 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 very curious to see the performance on that. And hopefully we'll get a unit in from Dell to look at that when a little closer to when they ship. But I think the big news for us at This Week in Computer Hardware is that AMD is absolutely, totally, and utterly taking 7 nanometer into the mobile space and gunning for Intel's biggest moneymaker on the CPU side, which is, of course, laptop processors or mobile processors.
And that was the big sticking point. We talked so much in 2019 about Ryzen 3000 processors, and they're on 7 nanometer Zen 2 architecture. And as complicated as CPU microarchitecture is, just the fact that they reached that 7 nanometer number allowed them to do things like really push it with aggressive clock speeds, release more cores because they went to a new manufacturing technology that uses something called chiplets, which are little CPU. Well, they're small CPU dies that go onto a larger substrate, and you can put more than one of them onto a CPU. So on desktop, they can fit 2 of these things in the same size processor package that used to top out at 4, 6, maybe 8 cores, and now we have products like their 16-core Ryzen 9 3950X. So on the mobile side, though, there was Ryzen 3000, which was just kind of rebranded Zen Plus technology from the year before. So it was still on 12 nanometer. It didn't really make the impact on mobile that you would expect. Although we talked previously about Intel's woes, kind of getting products out the door, and they had their own 14 nanometer issues with supply. So more and more laptops started becoming available with AMD as an option, even though it was an older architecture. The great thing now, as far as competition goes and seeing where this will take us as far as mobile performance in 2020, is Zen 2 is now on mobile. That was their big announcement. And we're talking about mobile parts that are up to 8 cores, 16 threads. And that's from a 45-watt part. That would be the Ryzen 7 4800H. And actually, a 35-watt variant of it called the 4800HS also exists. ASUS has one in a ROG notebook. But, it's pretty serious stuff. We're talking about, 4, 6, 8-core hyper-threaded, or in this case, SMT, like multi-threaded parts for mobile at 7 nanometers, hitting the kind of TDP targets that we've been used to from Intel with their higher performance mobile parts, which up until recently, I think the highest part from Intel on mobile is probably going to be, I think it's 8-core, 16 threads as well. There's an option for that in some very high-end notebooks and like the new MacBook Pro and that sort of thing. Prior to that, they'd had an option for up to 6 cores. And across the board, most of their options are around the 4-core mark. And those are still 14-nanometer parts. There are some 10-nanometer parts out there. We definitely saw more announcements of 10-nanometer stuff from Intel at CES. But just the fact that Ryzen 3000 is now on mobile, it's called Ryzen 4000. That's the thing. The mobile parts are going to be a generation ahead as far as the naming convention goes, but it's literally just the notebook variant of 2019's like hottest CPU product. So that's very big news, and just everything that involves. And really at this point they don't have Navi on mobile. We haven't, we know that's coming. We know they're working on Navi integration with APUs. Obviously, AMD has scored the win with both of the new gaming systems coming out, both the Xbox and the PlayStation 5. So we know that's coming. But for now, we've already seen things at CES like the 4800 Ryzen 7 mobile part paired with like an RTX 2060 in a high-end gaming laptop. And that's just something that it's just totally foreign to anybody who's gone to any of these shows or covered this industry for the last 5 or 6 years, when any gaming laptop, period, or productivity machine, the one I'm holding in my lap right now, was always some form of either a Core i5 or a Core i7 mobile Intel part. And if it offered discrete graphics, it was probably going to be an Nvidia discrete graphics chip. And now AMD has found their way into more and more laptop models throughout 2019. And now isn't just a sort of Me Too product where they can fill a void left by Intel struggling to meet demand for their 14 nanometer mobile parts. Suddenly it's a significantly better alternative in some cases, depending on what the target is. I can't wait to get these in because we can look at charts, and we're looking at a visual right now if you're watching the video of single threaded performance gains, multi-threaded gains, the graphic performance, because there are integrated graphics with these as well. But just getting them in hand, testing these laptops and seeing what the finished product is going to be, if the battery life is going to be any different than an Intel part. Because if we get these and they run at the same temperatures as an Intel part and they have about the same battery life, but you're getting higher core counts, I feel like it could do the same thing that Ryzen did on desktop, where it really pushes Intel to respond with more and more of what had been reserved for those ultra high performance, like mobile workstation parts.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of what this is. Like the 4800 Ryzen part is like a mobile workstation CPU.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's the big thing for me is like purely from a CPU performance standpoint, this is fantastic, right? Because we can pretty much guarantee they're going to cost less, or for the same amount of money, you're going to get a lot more cores. What I'm very curious about is to see how AMD's architecture fares with battery life, because so much of Intel's technical prowess or engineering focus over the last few years has not been about like upping the amount of work for clock cycles so much as they have been working on reducing the amount of energy consumed by the processor and all, and the associated chipsets and everything else around it. And they have a lot of fairly serious engineering acumen tied up in that, we think. And part of the reason we think that, or I think that, is because, Intel told us for years that the CPU is not the big power consumer. The CPU is not the big power consumer. It's the screen. And then they did a massive change. They just re-architected the way they handled, the power moving through the processor. And all of a sudden, battery life went up by like 50%. And it was just kind of like, okay, that happened. But to get back to where you were going, I think if you can get more performance but you half the battery life, this becomes a much less compelling story. I think they have to deliver battery power that is comparable to the Intel parts or the Intel battery lives we're used to. I mean, this is exciting, though. I really want to see whether or not, HP and Dell and, Lenovo step up to sign up for these parts on their premier laptop lines, which would be a gutsy move for them too, because it's going to piss off Intel, and there's always the possibility, is AMD going to be able to scale on this? Are the parts going to be? It's always exciting when you go with something new. But AMD has a lot of experience with 7 nanometer at this point, and we seem to still be able to buy GPUs. So I feel that the process is working. That said, I think their goal is to sell like an order of magnitude more mobile processors than they sell GPUs, because there's a lot more mobile users than there are people with graphics cards for gaming. So,
yeah, very true.
I mean, in terms of like our coverage, this is probably the biggest story at the show.
And it seems like a low key story. It's mobile parts, and it's always exciting to talk about big desktop processors. Well, we'll talk about one of those in a minute, but if you look at the way that people actually use computers, they're using laptops by and large.
Yeah. And it's just it. They're using laptops by and large, and they're using Intel-powered laptops by and large. And all of a sudden, this could be a very compelling alternative to using Intel for laptops. And, we're talking about lowering prices on Intel CPUs. We're talking about some really, really interesting stuff. While we're talking about AMD and CES 2020, they also dropped the 64-core Threadripper 3990X is going to be arriving in February at an eye-searing $3,990, which I think in terms of the amount of work it can do is perfectly reasonable. But the idea of a $4,000 processor mildly terrifies me. But I mean, it was funny because we just got a question from M. Dolan. And Mr. Dolan asks, how do I convince someone to buy a Ryzen 7 3700X instead of an i7 8700K? And I was laughing because a very close friend of mine has been running a Core i7 920 for a staggering amount of time. And he's like, I finally need to upgrade this CPU. There's a significant jump in performance if I upgrade to a moderately priced CPU. It's going to massively reduce the amount of electricity the computer consumes at idle. I, of course, got my AMD flag and started waving my Ryzen banner around. And he's like, I trust Intel. I don't know about AMD. And I mention that because this is a super rational benchmarking kind of hardcore guy who completely understands the performance delta for the dollars he's putting into Intel versus AMD. Yeah, he does appreciate the single core performance advantage on Intel, but that single core performance advantage has dropped considerably from where it was. And I think at some point you tell people the performance. If they're running, multi-threaded apps, if they're running lots of apps simultaneously, if their life isn't running one application on one core, man, the AMD parts are really compelling for the money. And there we go. V-Ray render 30% faster. Yeah.
Now,
and that's
what's awesome about this is, of course, AMD picks one test where they know they're going to be significantly better.
They do that.
It's not something that's going to be optimized.
So does everyone else.
Right, of course. So
yeah.
So their on stage demo comparing the render time of a Ryzen Threadripper 3990X versus the dual Xeon Platinum 8280 system, which combines to be 56 cores and 112 threads for $20,000 roughly. But then again, you never really know the pricing on this stuff.
Right.
Because their prices can vary depending on their client and that sort of thing. But a $4,000 processor may sound insane, but
compared to a $20,000.
Well, right. And even Intel's own, the EPYC is what this is based on. So the EPYC 7700 series, the second generation EPYC, which are priced between $6,500 and $7,000, have lower base and boost clocks. And now we have a consumer variant of that 64 core, 128 thread part that's priced under $4,000. So when you think about putting together a workstation, like say you're going to build a workstation for 4K, 8K video editing, something like that, or just 3D rendering, and you're pricing it out. If you've looked at workstations are thousands of dollars. We talked about the Mac Pro when it launched, and there are people who can completely rationalize spending $6,000 and up on a Mac Pro because they're using Final Cut and they want the performance, and it's worth it to them. It's an investment. The more and more hardware they put into it, well, even if it's a $20,000 or $30,000 configuration, it makes sense to them because they're saving time on their processing and rendering.
No, and $6,000 may sound like a lot, but hey, if I bill it $100 an hour and it saves me $100 hours a year, or 1,000 hours a year, or even 50 hours a year, that's a quantifiable number. And if you're looking at, if I am outfitting a server farm, it's like this is. If you trust the quality of AMD's processors, if you trust the quality of their firmware, if you trust the quality of their chipsets, which for the most part, I don't think there's a lot of reason not to at this point. It's always a little exciting when they come out with a new one because they're not as big as Intel. They don't have as many engineers. They have a finite number of humans. Just like Intel does, Intel just has a much larger finite number. But that's a huge deal. You can get one machine or 5 machines or CPUs. That's huge. That's ridiculous. That's the kind of thing that changes the market and the pricing.
It's not like they did this and it's like, well, it's 2 gigahertz, but we got 64 cores in there. If you actually look at the specs, this is boosting up to 4.3 gigahertz max, and that's always a variable thing based on cooling and other considerations. But the nominal speed is still 2.9 gigahertz, and we're talking about 64 cores and 128 threads. So it's just insane. And you pair this up with like a high-end motherboard for this platform is about $800, maybe a little bit more. And that's kind of your starting point. But even still, you combine the CPU and the motherboard, you're still only at about $5,000. Then you throw in as much memory as you can afford, and a couple of high-end monitors, and you're still probably under 10 grand for what would be just unthinkable computing power even 2 years ago. That would have cost you. I mean, think about that Intel solution that they had on stage. This is a real thing. You can really spend $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 on a dual Xeon workstation, and they're saying in certain workloads it could be a lot faster. So Intel on their side, their argument is going to be they have the instruction advantage. They have this thing called Deep Learning Boost, which is kind of their branding for AVX 512 instructions, which AMD does not have a license for. So there is no AVX 512 in EPYC in these this processor, this Ryzen Threadripper 3990X, or in any of the other Ryzen desktops. However, if you're not using an application that really makes use of AVX 512, then you're going to see no real advantage on the Intel side. Of course, Intel, we didn't really get into Intel. They're on their side, they're really pushing that side of things, their instruction advantage, and saying, we're really optimized for things like Adobe applications, which they are. But if you're, like I said, if you're using an application that's kind of hardware agnostic as far as how it's optimized, and you're just throwing compute horsepower at the problem, then AMD is it has a huge lead right now. There's no way to argue with this many cores for this amount of money. And even $4,000, as outrageous as that sounds at first, it's not that much. You're getting two 32-core Threadrippers in one for $4,000. And their 32-core Threadripper is $2,000. So there is no premium being placed on this being a 64-core part. It's kind of staggering when you think about it like that.
It's incredibly staggering. Something I noticed as I was bombing through, I'm only at CES for a couple days this year, and I was bombing through the central hall to pick up my media stuff when I got here. I noticed something missing from literally the other end of the building I'm in right now. Back in that corner, traditionally has been Intel's turf at CES, and there was no Intel there. Now, Intel did come to CES. They had a keynote. It was interesting, right? Because they, similar to what we talked about last year, last year we were like, hey, Intel paid attention to gaming and CPUs. That's crazy talk. But like a lot of other companies, they started out discussing a lot of what was going on with artificial intelligence. They've got some interesting projects using artificial intelligence to try to create VR without goggles by blending multiple camera angles into a single frame. It's actually more of an augmented video experience than a virtual experience. Their moving Project Athena, which is their sort of next generation, super thin and light, powerful laptop architecture. It started on Ultrabooks, and that was Windows 10 with 10th gen Ice Lake processors, or I should say, with the 10th gen Ice Lake processors, they're actually moving into the world of Chromebooks, which I think is really interesting. And there was some discussion about whether or not Chrome OS is stalled, but there's still a ton of people using it. It's incredibly popular in the United States in the educational sphere. I've seen security companies using it for rank and file where they want to keep their systems secure. They talked about 25 new Project Athena devices that have been certified at this point. And Chromebook getting Athena, I think, will be a boon for Chrome users who are looking for more power. Foldable laptops was a big thing for them. And, they had their Horseshoe Bend prototype. Which reminds me a lot of that's a 17-inch folding laptop. You see that gigantic screen there. It reminds me of something Lenovo did a few years ago where they had e-ink for the keyboard and then a standard sort of LCD on the top half of a portable. But in this case, it is an entire screen that wraps up, which is enormously similar to what Lenovo announced. And I got a chance to get hands-on a very, very, very early version of this a few months ago, which is the ThinkPad X1 Fold. And let me say that one more time. ThinkPad X1 Fold, where it literally folds over. And it was really interesting to play around with that in a very, very early beta. But that joint is very, very sophisticated. And as we've said about the phones, we're very, very curious to see how those, when LCDs can fold, and they did a lot of engineering to make sure that fold was supported and contained. They don't want to have a Samsung Fold issue. But I'm super curious to see what that ends up costing and how well it works in the field. It worked, again, I just saw a very early beta of it. It felt good, looked good. Super curious about that. Probably the biggest thing, of course, is the new Tiger Lake CPUs, which are, I read that it was like double digit, low teens.
They're saying double digit gains for graphics, even over the 10th gen Ice Lake that have already been shown, which is amazing if that's the case, because we saw just some early looks. I think it was actually with a Dell laptop. It was the XPS 2-in-1 that was announced, I think, at Computex. And we looked at numbers and benchmarked that against an AMD Ryzen APU laptop, and it was great. Like, there were many cases where it was actually faster than an APU. And for them to come out and say this next generation of mobile parts on 10 Plus, their new 10 Plus architecture is going to be even faster, like significantly faster in the graphics department. So
well, they're saying, I mean, they're saying double double the boost or double the performance. Goodness, there's a sentence in here somewhere. Doubling the performance, being able to play HD games, on an Ultrabook, and actually talking about having a boost in performance in Adobe Creative apps. Did they get too much into that? Okay.
No, I mean, that was that whole DL boost thing. Like, because of their instruction set advantage, and clearly they must have been working with Adobe on this, because there is optimizations there, and they have a tremendous advantage in certain workloads. I mean, certainly.
They're talking about like a 5x performances. I think is what Jim was writing about on PCPer.com. That's huge. But of course, the thing is, if you've never learned about some of the back end of Adobe products, for example, Photoshop, different algorithms can, it's a complicated program. Different things can take advantage of different instruction sets with different platforms with different GPUs. But yeah, if they're talking about 5x performance on stuff that people do a lot, that is huge. Or more importantly, if it's a 5x performance boost on something you do a lot, that is an incredible motivator to want to get into that. And it's a big deal.
Jim had attended the briefing on this, and he wrote it up, and I'm looking through his notes, and what they're advertising, basically their up to 5x performance increase is for something like tasks
blurring a
in
photo
Photoshop, deep blurring a photograph, isolating background noise, automatically selecting and masking objects in photo and video editing. Like when it goes through and tries to find the faces and is assigning identities to that sort of thing. Any of the AI sort of leveraged work that can be done within Adobe Creative Suite, that's where this DL boost is really going to give you a huge advantage. So if that's what you do, if that's what you live in Photoshop and Lightroom when you're doing these sort of tasks, Intel is probably still a better platform for you. And they're definitely pointing to the areas where they have a significant advantage. Because if they're just talking about straight up compute power, AMD basically ate their lunch all year last year. So
harsh but fair. Something that I didn't expect to see. Jim wrote up on PC Per, the DG1 discrete graphics, which is not. Okay, I'm going to read the sentence here. Intel has long been developing its own Z discrete graphics architecture, and the company ended its keynote by very briefly teasing an early look at its first mobile discrete client's graphics chip, the DG1. So not a desktop gaming card, but faster graphics or an actual graphics chip for mobile devices. So it's coming. There will be a third player in the discrete GPU market if this comes true. And part of what gives them or help them, they said that developing the Z architecture gave them the technology to give that 2x gain over UHD graphics. I'm very curious to see when we finally start seeing those and how well they perform. Which reminds me, while we're talking graphics, there was no NVIDIA keynote this year. No. And if you go to the NVIDIA blog where it's, future focus CES 2020, because they've pretty much been here for the last 5 years, scheduling an awkwardly late press event at the end of the day when everyone's exhausted, usually starting it late. Not that I'm bitter about that experience. But you can go up to their blog page. C-Fast G-Sync displays, Max-Q thin and light laptops, new RTX studio systems, and autonomous everything in Vegas. And, we still think of them as a graphics company, but they still want to be thought of as an AI company when you go up to their website. But, oh, goodness. I feel
their biggest story was basically a new driver, which is fine.
Yeah,
but the CES 2020 game ready driver was the big story, and their new addition is, well, they have a couple of improvements, but the new thing is max frame rate. You can actually go in and set a maximum frame rate for your game now.
Right.
This is something that you can do to help lock in a variable refresh range or just basically lower latency because you can push a more consistent fast frame rate in certain games, especially like MOBAs and any of the more competitive like esports type titles, which I think is where a lot of these requests had come from. But they said it was their absolute most requested feature. So that is now in the software, along with some changes to like image sharpening and a new variable rate shading feature for VRSS, where it's basically doing like the foveated rendering where there's one like focused area of the screen and then the rest of it can sort of be rendered at a lower resolution. You can increase the frame rate and the performance for VR. But, you know, no hardware. I mean, AMD had graphics hardware. They announced the Radeon 5600 XT graphics card, which is, it's really just the 5700 minus. It's exactly the same core count. It's the same GPU die. It has lower clocks and lower speed memory. And they went from 8 to 6 gigabytes. So we'll definitely have one of those when they come out, and we'll test it and all that. But that
you sound so excited about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a 5700 with lower clocks and slightly less RAM. And I think I had talked about at some point last year, I feel like I have this memory of saying AMD just needs like a 6 gigabyte part, something to compete with Nvidia. Maybe I thought it. But Nvidia has products like the GTX 1660 Ti and then the 1660 Super that have 6 gigabytes of RAM, and they're like perfect for 1080p gaming, and they're right in that $220 to $300 range. So if you're serious about 1080p gaming, that's what you might get. And then on the AMD side, they had these sort of aging Polaris parts, and then they had kind of an underwhelming, disappointing sort of 5500 product that came out. 5600 XT bridges the gap, and the problem is, once again, without spending all day on this, AMD has released a GPU with a price that is probably as high as they can possibly justify. So it's $279.99. So it's going to go up head to head with the GTX 1660 Ti at $279. So, and the performance in certain titles that they picked for the presentation was like 10% higher. So if it's an AMD optimized game at 1080p max settings, apparently it's a faster card. My only concern is probably across the board we'll see only modest gains, if any, over a 1660 Ti at the same price point. And then the real problem is the pricing gap between that and a 5700 is not very big. We've currently, like at Micro Center, you can buy a reference 5700 right now for $300. So if you can spend $30 more for 8 gigabytes of much faster memory and significantly higher core clocks, why wouldn't you? So they're cannibalized by their own 5700 part at that price point. I would love to see this come out at like $249, but we will talk about it more once we have it in hand and can actually benchmark it ourselves.
We wait, ladies and gentlemen, with bated breath. But I think you just heard the story on that GPU right there. Save a little bit more, get a much better performing part. CES 2020, ASUS announces the dual GeForce RTX 27 Mini, which, as someone who loves little tiny cases, little tiny high-powered GPUs, or having more of them, is always a plus. Anything particularly standing out about this one for you?
Not really. I mean, it's targeting that new NUC concept, the NUC 9 Pro and Extreme, and that's kind of how it was marketed. All of their imagery for this show it like right there in or next to the NUC. So but the nice thing about it is it has those really compact dimensions that we expect from those smaller cards to fit in little enclosures. And I don't think we're talking too much about the NUC 9 here, but it's funny to me to see a case concept and actually a computer concept that has so much in common with existing products we've seen in the enthusiast space. This looks a lot like the Dan cases enclosure, at least with the way it's laid out internally, where you have a small form factor power supply, and then you sort of sandwich the GPU and the motherboard up against each other to make it as small as physically possible. And what Intel is, of course, doing with this new platform is they're making a sort of a system on a card, which plugs in on one side, and then your dual slot GPU plugs in on the other side with the PSU down below. So I expect to see more cards like this targeting that. This Asus card is, it's an interesting attempt at this, and I think that what's great about it is for enthusiasts, it's a really nice looking compact dual fan card. So even if you don't want to get into that new Intel NUC ecosystem, you can also get yourself a very nice looking compact GPU for other enthusiast style cases. And I'm sure we'll see versions like cases that will be inspired by this new NUC for DIY, like mini ITX DIY.
Right. Which is a good thing as far as I'm concerned, living in a relatively small space at this point. MSI announces the Meg Aegis Ti5 gaming desktop and the RTX 2080 Ti Lightning Anniversary Edition graphics card. Whose anniversary?
MSI's anniversary.
That would make sense.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to get too much into this. MSI, along with all the other companies, and MSI actually, they always have a really big suite at CES, and you go in and they have just laptops and graphics cards and pre-built systems all over the place. And on the pre-built system side of things, they do make some really interesting stuff, and they always have some kind of wild case designs too to stand out. But yeah, I mean, it's just more of the we're looking at it right now. If you're watching the video, and excuse the somewhat blurry image that was sent out with the PR, which of course is funny because it's 2020 and it's still sometimes a struggle to get high resolution photography at times to accompany these press releases if you're not there in person to snap a photo of it. But yeah, just more kind of what we would expect from their gaming division. There's some like absolutely outrageous looking enclosures that actually have normal, full size, like off the shelf type hardware inside, so it's very upgradable.
It just reminds me of the head skull of a robot on a recent Netflix series. I just couldn't get over that, but it's got LEDs. It has LEDs everywhere. So does that. Oh my goodness. Project Unicorn, ladies and gentlemen. How many LEDs can you pack into one system? Not actually a lot of new developments in that area from last year because we had so much amazing LED memory last year. I'm digressing.
By the way, I'm sorry. I completely missed the headlining feature of that outrageous looking Aegis Ti5 desktop we were just looking at. It claims the crown as the first desktop with 5G connectivity, Patrick. And I know that's something that's near and dear to your heart. I was like, wait a minute, what was the big? Oh, it's the first 5G desktop, of course, because that's what we need. If you're at home, you could wire in directly to your cable internet connection or whatever you have, or you could connect to 5G. And Patrick, maybe your new mobile lifestyle, this is the perfect answer for you, where anywhere you go, you can still have a powerful gaming desktop that connects via 5G wirelessly anywhere in the world.
And, on this phone I'm holding right now, it says up in the corner. Let me pull it. Oh, it doesn't say up in the corner. Well, elsewhere in Las Vegas, up in the corner on this phone, it says 5GE, which is 5G enhanced because AT&T is better. Better. That's don't email. Well, email. We always love your emails. twich@twit.tv. Just don't email to tell me that my 4G phone isn't 5G just because AT&T put a 5GE in the corner. We know that story.
Hey, I remember back when I had, I think it was an iPhone 4S, and I got that little 4G logo when I was on AT&T.
And it got so much faster.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the LTE iPhone was a year away, but I had 4G on my iPhone, which was actually enhanced 3G. But they've learned their lesson. They're not calling it 5G; they're calling it 5G enhanced. Because
that's totally different.
LTE would probably be confusing to people. So
I Don't know what to tell you.
LTE minus? Or no, 5G minus.
We truly appreciate you listening to the podcast. We ramble on occasionally, Sebastian and I, and we appreciate that. And you should know that every day takes a team of hosts, producers, editors, engineers, and support staff to get up-to-date content to you. There's a whole crew at Twit and Petaluma that supports the creation of podcasts just like the one you're listening to. And that one you're looking at right now, if you're watching the video, This Week in Tech, that is the podcast that launched the Twit network. It has a no-holds-barred, lively discussion each and every week on everything that matters in technology. This Week in Tech, that pretty much says it all. Every week, Leo and an ever-changing cast of tech journalists and pundits gather around to discuss and dissect the latest news, innovations, privacy, and gear. They get into the pitfalls and the blunders in the world of tech, and they tend to be a little blunt about it. And there's laughter, there's humor, there's joy, occasionally tears, very occasionally. But mostly, you get an idea what happened in technology this week. You can trust us to get you caught up on everything happening in the tech universe. If you haven't, you know what? Subscribe to This Week in Tech on your favorite podcatcher or visit the website at twit.tv/twit. Thank you again for listening to This Week in Computer Hardware. And if you haven't in a while, go check out Twit at twit.tv/twit and find out what you missed in the world of tech this week. It may shock and amaze you. It might.
There's always something. Even when we think like this was a down show, there's going to be something out of CES that we probably didn't notice that they'll be talking about. So yeah, I'm always amazed at how much kind of residual news there is from CES every year, even when I think I saw everything.
Guys, there was something else. Something else for me, actually. One of the evening events, they have these evening events, which is a room filled with tables with vendors showing off stuff. And I caught something that'll be interesting for some of the folks out there using Mac laptops. The company's called LineDoc Co. It's, a lot of you probably already know about this. But if you haven't seen it, they have a new 16-inch one coming out. And it is essentially a port adapter and a battery that is aesthetically similar to and the same size as your MacBook, and it is.
That's awesome.
That was pretty much my reaction. I mean, you essentially end up with it's like carrying two laptops, but the laptops are so damn thin, you're not carrying much. But if you look at the pictures, if you scroll up, there's a picture where you see all of the ports it adds to the MacBook Air or MacBook Pro. You see all these glorious
Patrick,
cable
that's actually approaching a real computer.
Yes, it is.
You add full size. Wait a minute. Hold on. Is there an SDXC reader on that? Imagine.
Sure looks like that.
In 2015, when a MacBook Pro actually shipped with a full-size SD card reader in it, I had one. And since then, I've been very bitter. And I think
I was going to say, not you're bitter about it.
Not that I'm bitter at all about it. Using a plethora of Windows laptops over the last 4 years because I refused to get a MacBook that did not have full-size connectivity on it. But yeah, this I think we've mentioned a few times in the last year.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind a little bit thicker of a device if it had a bigger battery and more desktop-style connectivity on the side of it. And that's what's apparently called a mobile workstation now. So Apple, who does not currently make a mobile workstation, needs a little help, and this thing looks like the answer. Like, $349.
That's
the
Apple LineDoc
is nothing.
Oh, and so they're claiming 8 extra hours of battery life. That's 9 total ports on there, and that $350 price is with 0 gigabytes of SSD storage. You can go to 256 or 1 terabyte of storage, so you end up with all the ports, an SD card slot, an extra 8 hours of battery life, and up to a terabyte of additional storage. How much would you pay for it now? That'd be $699, and LineDoc.co is the website. I saw it. It was cool. I also saw the crew over at Targus. We're not going to get too deep into it at the moment, but the crew over at Targus has a whole bunch of new docks and some other stuff. I'll talk about those next week. Because they promised me they worked out some of the technical issues I ran into last time I looked at them. But some interesting stuff going on there. So, there's still a lot of computer stuff at CES. It just isn't front and center in the keynotes. Samsung's Odyssey G9, a 49-inch 512 by 1440 resolution, HDR 1000. Yes, I am so excited about HDR 1000 rating. It's 1,000 nits. That is not the ideal, which would be like 10,000 nits if you're Sony, but that is a spectacularly bright monitor that can deliver a tremendous HDR experience. Up to 240 hertz, 1 millisecond response time, support for both AMD's FreeSync 2, along with the newly added NVIDIA G-Sync compatibility. I am directly quoting The Verge there. And I completely read Chaim Gartenberg's paragraph, and I apologize for that. But I was like looking at this, and it's just, let me make sure everybody understands. It is a 49-inch QLED monitor, i.e. the stuff that they use in their top-of-the-line massive screens for your living room. 240 refresh rate, 1 millisecond response time, FreeSync 2 G-Sync compatibility. 5,120 by 1,440 pixels, which I already said, but that's just a lot of pixels, and I like saying it. It makes me happy. And also the HDR 1000. That's pretty. That's good.
Yeah. And there's a dramatic curve to this. Like the radius of this is, it will envelop you on your desk.
Well, it's also, so I've used a 38-inch monitor with a slightly lower radius, right? So when they talk about that 1,000 curvature, that's like a 1 meter. That's the radius measurement. So that's like that's normally, like, my primary one is like a 3.4 meter circle, which is very broad and shallow, which is very, very good for a workstation. This is going for literally 1 meter. So put your hand out here and go like this, and that's roughly the curvature of what that monitor is going to be. That's
curved, people.
That's going to envelop you, and you're either going. Yeah, I think that's going to be fantastic for gaming. I think it will drive you nuts, or at least there will be a learning curve where you get adjusted to using that. For if you're basically doing basic desktop applications, sometimes the really tight curves can be infuriating. You have to use one to find out for yourself on that. Be curious to see what it costs.
Yeah. I will say, though, real quick, this is the kind of thing that drives our industry. Like, well, not our industry, but the computer hardware industry, where you think, how much better does it have to get? Too. Like a GTX 1080 Ti was such a great graphics card that even the RTX 20 series stuff wasn't all that impressive because of how good Pascal had been. But still, you need even more than an RTX 2080 Ti. If you're starting to push 5,120 by 1440 pixels,
right?
If a display like this catches on, it becomes the enthusiast display to get, or some variant of it where it's an ultra wide, massive curved display like this that takes the place of those multi-monitor setups. And it's just, you can't throw enough GPU at that. So this would bring, a 2080 Ti to its knees, trying to play at that native resolution at high or ultra settings. And it's just kind of crazy. Just looking at this, because I know you, like you said, you had were using I know at one point last year you were using a Dell monitor that was almost 3 feet wide, but this is four. Yeah. This is more than 4 feet across.
I've used a 38-inch monitor, and it was, you have to have a large desk for that. This one won't. It would be curious to develop the actual sort of point-to-point distance, because it's 49, but of course it's got this massive curve in it. That's a big monitor, as in have a friend help you unpack that thing. 38's the biggest monitor I've used so far that was an actual computer monitor. I think it's going to be a very interesting experience if you can actually hurl enough pixels at it to make it look good. One of the things people were chatting about, and somebody buttonholed me last night as I was, walking across Las Vegas to find some place that was sort of out of the footprint of the CES exit mayhem, where I walked a mile and saved myself 30 minutes of waiting because traffic. But is ASUS ROG Swift, the first 360 hertz gaming monitor, is a display for the 1%, writes Polygon. Don't be taken in by marketing. Sumit Sakar over at Polygon.com wrote this up. I love that they refer to it as a display for the 1%. Don't be taken in by marketing. And I was laughing because earlier I had been in a discussion with a couple of people earlier in the day because they were like, well, who needs this? And I'm like, well, there's this very small group of incredibly talented esports gamers who have faster nervous systems than you do that are always looking for the sort of fastest screen resolution. So 360 hertz means, every second the screen gets updated 360 times. You need, as Sebastian was pointing out earlier, you need something that can feed that beast.
Yeah. There's a reason this is only 1080p, because you look at the specs like, 360 hertz. Well, it's 1920 by 12 or by 1080, but that's about as high as you'd even want to get. And because you just to even push 360 frames, you're running it at lower settings. Like you're not even running 1080 high, probably in most games.
Well, but it's medium. Also you're also moving so fast in these games. You're not like, wow. The shadows on those leaves are just, schwack. You get, spun in the head. What's really, really funny is, right, there's they linked to an Nvidia report that talked about how they could get these huge improvements in response time. Well, let me actually read Sumit's paragraph because he says it better than I can paraphrase it. NVIDIA's research department published a study in November that demonstrated measurable improvements in response time for aiming tasks when playing at high frame rates and high refresh rates with low latency. The study found that going from 60 hertz to 240 hertz provided a 33% improvement in flick shot hits in Overwatch for a test group of, quote, 8 skilled esports athletes. A tiny sample size. At 360 hertz, the improvement rose to 37% better than 60 hertz performance.
There's so many questions I'd have about a study like this because I'm so skeptical. But I'm sure there is something to be said for higher refresh, certainly. But when you have a sample size that small, I'm asking questions like, wait a minute, was this before or after they had another cup of coffee or an energy drink? Yeah. And was this the next day when they had more sleep? And
but it was funny, right? Because some people's response times are better than others, and somebody who games 8 hours a day, who is physically gifted with a nervous system and eyeballs to do this, is going to be able to take advantage of this. For the average human being, it's a complete waste of your investment, right? Because what Sumit calls out, and I think quite rightfully so, is they got an esports gamer who says this is for anyone who wants to invest in better performance, even if you're just playing for fun on the weekends with your friends, but you want to out-frag them.
I would like to see if this finally changes the discussion about CRT versus LCD as far as the lowest latency, fastest response time, because there are people who still swear by their giant Sony widescreen CRT monitors for competitive gaming, and if higher refresh rates do in fact end up translating into lower overall latency, then that's great. But for most people, just going up to 144 hertz is just changes everything. Like once you see higher refresh, you see just smoother everything. Just the UI and your operating system moving the mouse cursor around the screen, everything just feels different. Not to mention the fact that you can then, especially since most of these have variable refresh rate, you have a much smoother gameplay experience if you have the graphics horsepower for it. But I find it just interesting as a technical accomplishment. Hey, we made it. We hit 350 or 360 hertz. So, congratulations. LCD has arrived finally. But I hope this drives down the cost of like 240 and 144 panels. And I'm sure that's coming anyway. Just the widespread availability,
one would hope,
lower cost, such things. Yes.
Well, okay. Let's bring in a question from Austin, who last week emailed. He had a question about hertz versus frames per second on monitors, and Austin emailed, "I wanted to get your input on how frames per second (FPS) of a PC and refresh rate hertz of a monitor work together." And this is something we've touched on a lot over the past several years, the better part of a decade, because it's a battle. And G-Sync and FreeSync are all about managing the downsides of the relationship between hertz and frames per second. But Austin says, is one limited by the other? If a monitor can go up to 165 hertz, but your high-end first-party game at max at game settings can only hit 60 frames per second, does that mean the frames will limit what the monitor can visually display? Also, there must be a point where both of these numbers are too high to notice any difference, right? Do I have all this wrong? No. And what we just said about that 360 hertz refresh rate, it's incredibly cool. And, it's kind of like a Formula One car. There's a little group of people that can actually wring all the performance out of a Formula One car, and most of them are racing in Formula One or, working their way up to that point. Some of them never make it. But my point is there's a small number of humans on the planet that are probably going to be able to wring everything out of a 360 hertz monitor. And, if you're thinking, do I need a 360 hertz monitor? You don't. If you want to buy one, by all means, keep the economy moving. But, let's start with the basics. A monitor has a refresh rate. You're pumping out, graphics out of the back of your GPU, which we talk about in frames per second. What happens when, I want faster than 60 hertz? What do I do? What happens? Where did it all go wrong? Or should we actually just spend 20 minutes talking about this next week?
We could. I think the important thing to think about is there is a relationship between the two. And no, your monitor is not going to stop working because your graphics card cannot produce. Say you have just a 60 hertz monitor, because this is where screen tearing is really annoying for a lot of people, because you're playing a game, you have a 60 hertz monitor, and you get to a more graphically intense portion of the game where it drops down to say like 45 frames per second or 40 frames per second. And suddenly, if you don't have VSync enabled, you start to see the screen tearing. Like you see uneven portions of the screen being drawn, and the monitor is having to display portions of the previous frame, and the next frame finally starts coming in, and it's just they're out of sync with each other. So VSync allows for the monitor to basically receive a consistent number that it can display without having to redraw the same frame over again, and it can smooth things out. But if you go on to high refresh rate monitors, and really, this is where the variable refresh makes such a difference. And I may not be explaining this very well, but variable refresh, which seems to go hand in hand with high refresh monitors, is, say you have a monitor that can display 144 hertz, but it can also go all the way down to, say, 24 hertz. So regardless of what's happening in your game, the monitor is changing its actual internal refresh rate to match what your graphics card is able to put out. Anytime there's a disparity between those two, say your graphics card is producing 100 plus frames per second, you have a 60 hertz monitor or 100 hertz monitor. If it's producing more frames per second than your monitor can use, there are certain frames that are just going to be dropped before they can ever be displayed, which could result in a little bit of an uneven experience. You might see a little jerkiness if the game kind of jumps around because whatever is happening in the scene might be allowing the GPU to shoot out 120, 140 frames, and your monitor is only capable of producing about 80% of those, so certain information is lost. And I think it becomes more obvious, it's more problematic when the opposite is the case, where you have 144, you paid for that high refresh monitor, but your graphics card is still only pushing like 80 frames per second. So now you're having the same issues where the monitor is having to redraw the same frame again, and then a new frame comes in, and it's not a one-to-one experience. I think with monitors, having as close to a native experience as possible is what gives you the best quality. If we're talking about resolution, say you have a 1080p monitor, unless you're actually playing at 1920 by 1080, it's never going to look as crisp and sharp as it could be if it was native resolution. And if you're locked at 60 frames per second playing on a 60 hertz monitor, it looks really smooth. And when you move up to high refresh, it gets almost eerie. It's that kind of hyper real look that only like frame locked 144 or 240 hertz content on a 240 hertz monitor, for example. Like when it's 1-to-1, it looks buttery smooth. You don't see any screen tearing. You don't see any jumping. But it's all an inexact science. As inexact as what I just said, it's even more inexact because every moment in a game might be different. You're not playing if you're staring at a wall in your game and not moving, yes, that's a consistent experience. You can just really explore the wall and the textures.
But you probably have projectiles flowing through your frame, or the trees, or the road surface, or any of the okay, so Snoods is a bad example if you're old enough to remember Snoods in the audience, but for the vast majority of games, everything is changing constantly, and if there's an explosion, all of a sudden your GPU is working much harder to deal with all of the additional stuff that is or pixels that need to be generated to throw that explosion up on the screen. And we can get into a large discussion of frame rating and everything else, but you need a GPU and a CPU that can feed your monitor. You need to have the correct settings in your game to take advantage or to do the best job of updating the frame rate given the limitations of your CPU and your GPU. You need a monitor that actually has a decent refresh rate if you want to go. It's a balancing act.
And then, like we mentioned earlier, the frame limiter that's been introduced by NVIDIA in their latest software. That was their big thing at CES. That is all ties in with the same subject, because if you go into the software side of things and say, okay, my actual output to the monitor is going to be capped at whatever, you can type in a number. Say I'm going to cap it at 120, and I have a 120 hertz refresh monitor. Now, instead of a bunch of extra frames being shot at the monitor, which cannot display them because it exceeds its actual range, you are trying to make the two create a 1-to-1 ratio before it ever goes to the monitor, which creates a more a smoother experience. So I guess my point, if I were to distill it down to one sentence, would be high refresh can look very smooth, but nothing beats a perfect match between the number of frames per second being generated by the GPU and what the native refresh of your monitor is. So it's actually more important to buy a variable refresh monitor. With the bigger range is always better. Find one that has a really big, 20 to 140 hertz range or something, because that monitor can internally change the timing that you're seeing on the panel to match what's coming into the input. And that's when you start to see that the smoothness taken to the next level, because there'll be moments with high refresh that's not capped and that doesn't have any kind of variable range that looks smooth, but there will still be moments of tearing and moments where things kind of jump on the screen because there's not an even number of frames going to the monitor.
It's exciting, but do you have it all wrong? No. Is there a point where notice?
No, maybe yes. I do. I don't think I think that the question was very technical. The explanation was possibly questionable, but I hope. But
it's a messy area because you have a whole lot of things that involve, if a monitor can go up to 165 hertz, but your party game at max settings only hits 60 frames per second, you're essentially squandering the capabilities of your monitor. There's no reason not to game at 60 frames per second. You have no choice. It's much better than, I won't reopen this can of worms. It's just ideally be able to hit the refresh rate of your monitor, the native refresh rate. Cooler Master is something interesting. I was reading this up on The Verge. It's a Nook PC case, quote, bigger than Intel's, but smaller than Razer's. It's going to be $199 second quarter of 2020. And so Intel announced a new initiative. So gaming PCs with modular CPU cartridges, having just thrown out an AMD CPU cartridge a 8 weeks ago, I was laughing about that. I didn't actually throw it out. I actually put it in a bag and took it to an e-waste recycler. But these Nook elements, these cartridge-based PCs, these cartridge-based CPUs will be swappable. Razer announced a Tomahawk enclosure. Cooler Master has the one you're looking at right now, the NC100. So It's got the ability. It's going to have a baseboard that lets you plug in a NUC element. It's going to have an SFX power supply, which is something I am deeply intimate with. And if you want to know more about them, email twitch@twit.tv and ask questions. But it's an interesting and fairly affordable look at this. So, and apparently big enough to hold a full-length graphics card, according to folks at Cooler Master. So
that design looks a lot like, it's like a cross between the Dan case and like the N case M1, somewhere in there, where you're negotiating of like what looks like a shoebox basically, and figuring out the best way to put full size components in it. And really, from the main view here we're looking at, if you're watching the video, it looks a lot like the Dan case's case. So this, and at $199, that may sound expensive, but the only alternative for ultra small cases like this has been these crowdfunded cases that were quite expensive. So it's nice to see another option out there, mainstream option.
We're down with mainstream, or at least something we can afford in this lifetime. Of course, there were a lot of televisions at CES. One of the big darlings of the show that everybody's excited about was Samsung's 8K bezel-less display. They're talking about 99% of the screen being screen. It's pretty. Samsung came out with their Zero concept, and you're looking at, if you're watching the video, that's actually one of the 8K bezel-less displays. It's nice, actually. If bezels bother you, this is your monitor. Samsung also showed the Zero concept, which rotates so you can see all of your vertical video using the entire width of your screen.
Yes.
I
think there was something like this last year too. And that makes a lot of sense, because who wants to watch vertical video with those giant reflective bars they put up to sort of make it simulate what it would be if it was landscape?
Right. It's interesting, right? Because there's a whole new video service that was announced, that was baked in secrecy and announced a couple days ago. And the big thing about that video service, which I apparently can't remember the name of beyond that it starts with a Q, was that the way they're encoding it is it contains simultaneously a vertical and a horizontal, or a portrait and a landscape version of the video. So when they have their Hollywood directors create things, they have to frame things so that it works this way, or I should say this way, and this way, so that if you turn your phone or your tablet or your Zero TV, all that information will be needed to watch it in either way. Some cool soundbars from Vizio. Vizio announced an OLED TV. It was a lot of incremental stuff, a lot of kind of sort of prototypes. Like, what do you think of this? We did this. Not a lot of huge developments, but I'm curious to see Vizio doing an OLED TV. We're going to talk about this a bunch on AVXL with Robert Heron this week, or I am going to talk about this. Sorry, Sebastian. You can join in if you want to. Not a lot of speakers this year. Not a lot of headphones that stood out, although there's a couple things I haven't seen yet, because I'm not going to get to see a bunch of this show floor till this afternoon. A very incremental year in terms of televisions this year. The other odd thing that came out is that Sonos is suing Google, because apparently Google is violating a bunch of their patents based on things they learned while they were putting Home together, or porting Google into Sonos. But I'm very curious to see how this works out, because they've sued some other people, and all of the court battles are slowly working their way through the courts, or the previous suit. But yeah, this is interesting. Google's claiming, or Sonos is claiming, that Google is violating some of its patents. And in the words of Adi Robertson over at The Verge, quote, that Google stole its multi-room speaker technology after getting access to it through a 2013 partnership. So the goal was to get Sonos speakers running Google Play Music, but they're now claiming that Chromecast Audio and the Google Home lineup and the Pixel product lineup are violating their patents, or using things they learned during that partnership. So I'm curious to see where this ends up. But since we've talked about Sonos a lot over the years, I thought I would bring that up. So, yeah. And, the other thing I'd point out is to your Sonos, the upgrade thing where you brick perfectly good hardware to give people a discount on buying new hardware sucks.
I don't know if you're going to mention that or not, so I was holding my tongue. But yeah, I read about this. Actually, somebody in our chat, like on the PC Per side of things, mentioned this. And I'm like, wait, what are you talking about? I looked it up from October. And literally, they'll give you a 30% off coupon, or is it $30? I don't even $30 off of your new
30% off of your Sonos product. Okay, I think Sonos. They call it trade up.
You brick it and then take it to a recycler, or they'll take it back too. They'll let you send it back to them. But it's like, hey, we made this product that people really like, and they're hanging on to them. And 95+% of people who bought one are still using it. That's not good for business. So they're not breaking down. So we want you to artificially.
And the last thing we want is people buying used ones. Yeah. I mean, it's a significant discount. I can get why people might be motivated, almost, right? Because they're like, see what's new, the Connect amp, $419 with trade-up credit, save $179.70. Well, you know what? The Connect amps are still selling for $300 or $400 on Craigslist in the Bay Area. So, if you don't trust Craigslist or eBay, and nobody in your neighborhood wants to buy it, it pisses me off because you're taking perfectly good hardware that's really, really good. Sonos is like, it won't support the user experience that we want, but I have feels about that I won't get into at the moment.
And on the other side of the coin, I have feels about a certain co-host of this podcast who casually dropped that a K7 era cartridge-based AMD processor was recently taken to an e-waste recycler. Just because, obviously you don't like the experience of using an original Athlon anymore.
I have, okay, so let me put that into context. It was a unit I used to demonstrate on air back in the day. It had significantly damaged pins because of something someone did to it. I also have several things put away just for your terrible, terrible family-killing hobby of restoring old computer. I want to help contribute to the disintegration of your relationship with your child as you spend hours trying to get old DOS machines to run. You're covered, my friend. And let me tell you something. As I travel around America, I'll be looking out for some really, really rank 386 level stuff to send you. If there's a Pentium 90 in your future, I want to help make it happen. Because I swear I saw what must have been a Pentium 90 PC on a curb, like an old Micron. Like a Micron that I would have killed for 20 years ago. So
probably had like 16 megabytes of RAM in it too, like everything.
A lot of stuff out there. I'm not pointing to the booth behind me intentionally. I'm just saying there's a lot of stuff out there that's going to be really outdated but still usable or not in the future. So, reduce, reuse, recycle, try to keep things running for as long as possible. Try to get them a new user rather than e-cycling them whenever possible, because it's good for the planet. And because I used to drive by the one of the biggest, basically New York City's garbage dump for years. And I watch it kind of turn into a ski hill. So that's why I try to keep things running instead of throwing them in landfills. It's a thing. I want to know
why beige boxes just aren't around anymore. They all ended up in one of those places.
Oh, my goodness. I'm thinking about that now. A giant, like a ski hill made out of old computer parts. It's kind of terrifying. Or like a friend of mine was in Shenzhen, and he was like, yeah, you look down the crack in the asphalt, and there'd be like resistors and capacitors in there because this stuff's just everywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to This Week in Computer Hardware. We call it Twitch. We do it every week. We talk about hardware, in case you didn't pick up on that. The guy on, probably the left side of your screen, the handsome young man with a head full of hair, Sebastian Peak, editor-in-chief of PCPer.com. My name is Patrick Norton. I'm the other host, and I do a podcast called AVXL, which is about audio and visual technology, basically getting the most out of your budget to make your video and your audio be wonderful, the experience, that is. If you want more Twitch, and we hope you do us a favor, go over to twit.tv/TWICH. That's the website. It's got all the older episodes. It's got the audio, the video, 72,000 ways, several different ways to download it regularly and subscribe, or you can just go to your favorite podcatcher and search for This Week in Computer Hardware. Yeah. I think it about wraps it up, ladies and gentlemen. I got to post or help do my small part of posting this show. And then I have to bomb to the other side of Las Vegas to go see a thing that I can't talk about on camera, or I will be beaten to death by lawyers with baseball bats, because that's the kind of NDA I signed. And on that cheerful note, if you got a question, or if there's something you saw at CES you're curious what we think about, email us, twich, twich@twit.tv. And with that, I swear, I'm Patrick Norton.
And I'm Sebastian Peak.
We'll catch you next week on Twitch.